while you try to fall asleep in your bed. This is how Native Americans shared their stories. Let their story be heard too. It matters. Long before written symbols crossed these lands, long before paper or ink marked the passing of memory, the ancient Native American tribes shaped their world through stories carried by the human voice. Their histories lived not in libraries or carved monuments, but in the warmth of shared breath, in the rise and fall of spoken rhythm, in the glow of firelight reflected in attentive eyes. Every story told was more than entertainment. It was a lifeline, binding the living to the ancestors, the land, and the unseen spiritual forces that shaped all things. Across the continent, the landscapes themselves seemed made to receive these stories. In the eastern woodlands, towering forests muffled the night with thick layers of leaves, each breeze carrying faint rustles that blended with the cadence of a storyteller's voice. On the broad grasslands of the plains, the wind moved with a deep, sweeping whisper, bending oceans of tall grass as though bowing to the ancient words being spoken. Further west, great red canyons created natural amphitheatres where echoes repeated the rhythms of stories long after the storyteller's voice fell quiet. And far north, snow-covered forests glowed softly beneath the moon, while flames crackled, sending sparks swirling into the cold air like tiny messengers rising toward the stars. Nightfall in these times was not a simple shift from light to darkness. It was a transformation. As the sun slipped behind distant mountains or sank into the horizon of plains, the tribe began to gather. Tasks quieted, voices softened, and the crackling of the fire slowly became the center of attention. People moved toward its warmth, their shadows stretching long across the earth. The flames painted shifting patterns of amber across faces young and old, creating a shared world of flicker and glow where stories lived more vividly than daylight allowed. Within this glowing circle, the elders took their place. Men and women who had lived through countless seasons, who had watched entire generations grow, struggle, and flourish. These elders were the keepers of memory. They carried within them not merely stories, but the identity of the tribe itself. Their knowledge reached back through time in an unbroken chain. Stories passed from their own elders and from the elders before them, stretching into a past so distant it blended with the mythic origins of the world. To be a storyteller was not a casual role. It was a responsibility that demanded patience, memory, discipline, and reverence. The stories had to be remembered with precision, not as rigid recitations, but as living truths that had to be shaped with care. One misplaced detail could unravel meaning, for these stories carried guidance for survival, explanations of natural forces, moral lessons, and the tribe's understanding of the spiritual world. The storyteller did not simply speak. They wove, layered, and summoned images so vivid that the listeners could see the mountains forming, hear the footsteps of great beasts, feel the tremble of storms, and sense the presence of ancestors moving unseen among them. Around the fire sat the children, nestled close to their families, but rising slightly forward whenever the storytelling began. Their eyes reflected the firelight like luminous drops of amber, their attention drawn wholly into the narrative unfolding before them. For children, these nights were not only moments of wonder, they were the beginning of responsibility. By hearing the same stories repeated across seasons, they slowly etched every moment, every rhythm, every sacred lesson into their minds. They learned through immersion, through listening deeply, until the story belonged to them as much as to the elders who shared it. The fire itself seemed to become part of the storytelling. Flames crackled in steady bursts, the smoke rising in a thin column that twisted and widened as though forming shapes that matched the stories. Sometimes the sparks drifted upward into the dark sky, where millions of stars glittered in patterns that the tribes interpreted as older stories, those written not by human hands, but by the earth and sky themselves. In this way, storytelling became a meeting of worlds, the human voice, the unseen spiritual presence, and the vast expanse of nature all joined in a single moment. No two storytelling nights were ever exactly the same. Winter nights carried the deep stillness of snow and cold winds, sharpening the focus of the listeners who huddled around the fire for warmth. Summer nights glowed with soft breezes that carried the scent of wild grasses and distant rivers. Spring brought the sounds of awakening life, frogs echoing from wetlands, birds calling through the darkness. Autumn wrapped the world in the scent of drying leaves and cooling earth. Each season added its own atmosphere, shaping the tone and rhythm of the stories being told. In these early gatherings, the storytelling circle was more than a place of learning. It was a living bridge. Through it, the tribe maintained a connection to the ancestors whose footsteps had once pressed these same pathways, hunted along these same rivers, and looked upon these same constellations. The voices of the living merged with the memory of the dead, allowing the tribe to move forward without losing the foundation of who they were. This was how knowledge survived, carried on breath, guarded in memory, shared in firelight, and woven into the nights that stretched across generations. Long before their voices filled the firelit nights, the storytellers, the memory keepers of Native American tribes, were shaped by years of attentive silence. Their training did not begin with speaking, but with listening, absorbing the rhythm of stories until each tale lived deep within their bones. It was a slow, deliberate process, one that required patience as vast as the prairies and discipline as steady as flowing rivers. Through this quiet apprenticeship, they learned that stories were not simply collections of events. They were living beings that demanded respect, care, and truth. Each tribe had its own traditions, but everywhere across the continent, the process of becoming a story keeper followed a similar path. Children first learned to listen, not passively, but with a reverence that felt almost ceremonial. They studied the cadence of the storyteller's voice, the pauses held at the edge of important moments, the way a gesture or a slow shift of breath could alter the meaning of a tale. They learned when to be still, when to open themselves to the world beyond the circle of fire, and when to feel the story rather than simply hear it. In time, a few children stood out for their attentiveness, for their uncanny ability to recall even the smallest detail of the tales repeated through the seasons. These children grew into youths who were quiet observers of life around them, while others trained in hunting, crafting, or guiding canoes along winding rivers. These chosen listeners paid attention to the subtleties that often went unnoticed. They watched how the weather moved across the land, how the animals migrated, how the sky shifted with the seasons. Their minds became vast storage places, holding not only the stories spoken to them, but the patterns of the natural world. This ability to connect human history with the landscape was essential. For in Native American cultures, stories were inseparable from the earth. Every mountain, river, animal, and star carried meaning, and the storyteller needed to understand these meanings intimately. Years later, when these youths matured, an elder might invite them into the deeper layers of memory. These were not lessons taught openly, but shared in rare moments, often during long travels, quiet tasks, or nights when the world felt especially close. The elders passed down the stories that were rarely spoken aloud to the entire tribe. Stories of creation, of migrations across ages, of ancient agreements with the spirits of the land. These tales were the foundation of identity, the roots of culture, the earliest memory of the people. They were entrusted only to those who had proven their patience and devotion to the craft of remembering. To carry such stories was a great honour, but it was also a weight. Story keepers held the responsibility of preserving not only the words, but the spirit and intention behind them. They had to remember the tone, the imagery, the lessons, the warnings, all without altering the truth. Even the slightest shift in emphasis could change how a future generation understood their place in the world. And so the story keepers learned to hold memory with precision, balanced by creativity. They did not recite mechanically. They breathed life into the stories while protecting their shape. The stories themselves varied widely. Some were vast, sweeping narratives of how the world was shaped, from the rising of the first mountains to the arrival of the first people. Others were quieter tales that taught moral lessons, cautioning against greed, recklessness, or disrespect toward nature. Some stories held practical knowledge: how to follow migrating herds, how to read the stars for navigation, how to survive winters that could stretch long beyond expectation. There were family stories, clan stories, tribal stories, and stories shared among many nations that crossed long distances through trade and alliance. But the most sacred stories were those tied to the land. Each place carried a memory. A rock formation might be the resting body of a great spirit. A river bend could be the site of a legendary crossing. A mountain peak might have once been a living being whose transformation shaped the surrounding world. Through these stories, the tribe learned not merely to survive on the land, but to live with it, respecting its rhythms and honouring its power. The storyteller was the guide who kept these connections alive. And so, as the years passed, the memory keepers became guardians not only of tales, but of the identity of their people. Through their voices, the past stayed vibrant and near. Through their patience, generations remained linked like beads on a long, unbroken strand. Through their discipline, no story was lost to time, no lesson forgotten, no ancestor left unheard. This was how the knowledge endured, gathered slowly, carried through lifetimes, and shaped with reverence until the story keepers were ready to pass their sacred memories to those who would one day continue the lineage. When the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the world settled into its quiet, the storytelling circle formed not as a gathering of individuals, but as a single, living classroom without walls, borders, or written lessons. The earth itself was the floor, the sky the ceiling, the fire at the center, the lone teacher whose light illuminated the faces of those who came to learn. In ancient Native American tribes, learning was never confined to childhood. It spanned an entire lifetime. And in this circle, every age held a seat. Every generation felt the pull of memory, and every mind, young, old, weary, curious, was shaped by the stories unfolding in the glow. At the circle's heart burned the fire, its flames rising and falling like a breathing creature. It was more than warmth. It was the oldest witness to the tribe's history, present for countless nights of laughter, loss, ceremony, and remembrance. The fire turned every face into a page of living history, lines deepened by time, eyes softened by age, expressions sharpened by curiosity. Its light softened the boundaries between the generations, casting all of them in the same warm glow, reminding them that they belonged to one continuous story. Children sat closest to the flames, not out of privilege, but because their minds were still wide open to wonder. The warmth eased their restless energy, drawing them into a stillness rare during the daylight hours. The shadows stretched long behind them, merging with those of their parents and grandparents. They listened not only with their ears, but with their entire being. Their breathing slowed, their eyes widened, their thoughts quieted. This openness was the first step of learning, absorbing the story before understanding it, memorizing its shape before grasping its meaning. Behind them settled the adults, hunters whose hands were scarred by years of tracking through wilderness, gatherers whose knowledge of plants was etched into their memories, artisans whose craft spoke of centuries-old traditions. These adults did not sit as passive listeners. They too were students, always learning, always interpreting. Every story carried layers of meaning, and a person could only understand the deeper layers with life experience. A tale heard as a child, transformed when heard again in adulthood. Lessons once dismissed as simple warnings became profound truths when viewed through the lens of lived seasons. In this circle, the passage of time was itself a method of teaching. For ancient Native American tribes, the land itself was not a backdrop for their stories. It was the living source from which those stories emerged. Every hill, every river bend, every shifting shadow of a canyon wall carried history. The earth held memories older than any human voice, and the storytellers drew from these silent records to shape the tales passed from generation to generation. In this way, the land and the stories could never be separated. To understand one was to understand the other. As the fire crackled and the night settled, listeners were transported far beyond the circle of warmth. The storyteller's voice opened vast landscapes within their minds. Grand mountain ranges rising like the spines of ancient beings, rivers carving deep paths through stone, forests breathing with an unseen pulse. Each place had a story, and each story carried a truth about how the tribe came to be, how they traveled, how they survived. These tales were not abstract myths, but living memories tied directly to trails, cliffs, springs, and valleys that the listeners knew intimately. The people learned to see the land not just with their eyes, but with a deeper awareness. A rock formation on the horizon might resemble a slumbering animal, and the story behind it taught the tribe about an ancestor's journey or a lesson learned through hardship. A waterfall could represent a moment when the world shifted, when the seasons changed, when spirits intervened, or when the balance between people and nature was restored. Even the shape of a cloud or the sudden flight of birds might echo an ancient tale that explained why such things happened. Every natural feature held meaning, linking the physical world to the spiritual world and to the long-reaching chain of history. These landscape stories were more than explanations, they were guides for living. A tale about a river spirit warned children never to disrespect the water, for it sustained the tribe through droughts and harsh summers. A story about a mountain guardian reminded hunters to take only what was needed, preserving the balance between people and animals. A legend tied to a particular grove of trees taught gatherers which plants could heal and which held power, best approached with caution. Through the stories, the land became a teacher, and the stories became a map that guided the tribe's behavior and ensured harmony with the world around them. Behind them, often wrapped in blankets or animal hides against the cool night, sat the elders, those whose memories reached farthest. Their presence added gravity to every story. They had heard each tale many times through storms and droughts, through years of plenty and years of hardship. They remembered the subtle shifts made by storytellers before them and the way the stories evolved while retaining their roots. When an elder listened, they listened with an awareness of centuries. They carried a living sense of continuity, like bridges connecting the tribe's earliest ancestors to the children warming their hands near the embers. The circle itself served as more than a physical formation. It was a symbolic representation of the tribe's worldview. There was no beginning or end to a circle, no one place considered more important than another. Knowledge flowed around it freely, touching every person equally. Just as the seasons moved in cycles and the stars returned to their places in the sky, the circle reflected the belief that life, death, memory, and renewal were all part of one great pattern. Every time a story was told within this formation, it reaffirmed the tribe's relationship with the natural world and with one another. The sounds within the circle formed a kind of nightly symphony. The fire cracked with sharp, bright notes. Wind threaded through tall grasses or pines, carrying a low, continuous hum. Insects chirped rhythmically, and distant animals called from the dark wilderness. Owls, wolves, frogs, each adding their own voice to the night. These sounds blended with the low, steady tone of the storyteller's narration until the boundary between human sound and nature's sound dissolved. The listeners felt themselves held within something larger than the story alone. They were inside a world where everything, land, animal, ancestor, breath, flame, was part of the lesson. No one took notes, no scrolls were passed, no symbols were drawn, yet no detail was lost. The mind, trained by this nightly ritual, became a vessel more precise than any written page. Each listener stored the stories differently. Children held onto imagery, adults held onto meaning, elders held onto continuity. Together, the tribe preserved every layer, ensuring that no story faded entirely, even as time swept relentlessly forward. And so the circle remained the tribe's living classroom, ever formed, ever renewed, where the lessons of the past were carried through the present to be offered to the future. It was here that memory was shaped, understanding deepened, and identity strengthened. Night after night, generation after generation, the circle stood as the heart of the tribe's knowledge, pulsing with the steady flame of their shared heritage. When the tribe moved from one region to another, following herds, seasonal harvests, or ancestral migrations, the stories moved with them. They adapted, expanded, and intertwined with new landscapes. Over generations, the stories became a record of the tribe's travels, marking where ancestors once walked and where new chapters of their history were formed. Even after many seasons passed and memories blurred, the stories ensured that no place of significance was forgotten. The land remained alive in their minds, carried with them even when they journeyed far from it. The storytellers knew that each story was a thread in a much larger tapestry, a tapestry woven across centuries and anchored to the deeply rooted connection between the people and the earth. They recounted tales with a sense of grounding, as if the soil beneath their feet held the very memories they spoke aloud. And in a way, it did. The ancestors had walked on this same ground, breathed this same air, relied on these same rivers and forests. Their experiences were infused into the land, and the storytellers brought those memories to life through their voices. During the storytelling nights, the listeners would sometimes glance beyond the fire toward the faint silhouettes of distant mountains or the dark ribbon of a nearby river. In those moments, the land felt closer, almost as if it leaned inward to listen. The stories seemed to rise directly from the earth, not invented, not imagined, but revealed. The people understood that the land remembered them just as they remembered it. Their footsteps, their struggles, their celebrations, their sorrows, all were imprinted upon the land, shaping its stories just as surely as the land shaped theirs. As generations passed, the land-bound stories grew in number and depth, becoming a vast archive of knowledge. They held instructions for survival, warnings of past dangers, reverence for sacred places, and celebrations of creation and renewal. Through these stories, the tribe learned not only who they were, but where they belonged, and how their existence intertwined with every living thing around them. This living connection between story and land reinforced a powerful truth. Memory was not stored in a single place or a single person. It was shared across the world, carved into rivers, whispered through pine needles, swept across plains by the wind. The land itself became a keeper of stories, and through the storytellers, those stories were offered back to the people, ensuring that the past remained alive in every step they took. Though many stories were shared around the fire beneath the vast blanket of night, countless others lived in motion, woven into the rhythms of walking, working, travelling, and the quiet spaces between tasks. For ancient Native American tribes, storytelling was not confined to a single time or place. It flowed through the daily movements of life like a river that never stopped, carrying knowledge from moment to moment, season to season, generation to generation. When families travelled across forests thick with cedar and spruce, the stories travelled with them. The crunch of footsteps on pine needles created a steady, grounding rhythm that mirrored the cadence of memory. Elders walking at the rear of the line often murmured fragments of stories to young ones beside them, not in conversation, but in quiet recitation meant to imprint the message gently, like soft rain settling into soil. These moving stories were the ones tied to migration, stories that explained why the people travelled, where their ancestors had journeyed before them, and how the land ahead held memories waiting to be uncovered. In the vast openings of the plains, where the grass moved like a great rolling sea, stories drifted across the wind. Hunters tracking buffalo along ancient paths recalled tales of how the animals first came to the earth, how their spirits guided the people, and how respect sustained the balance between hunter and hunted. These stories, whispered in long strides across open land, merged with the steady beat of footsteps until the rhythm of walking and the rhythm of the story aligned as one. The plains themselves seemed to breathe with the memory of these migrations, remembering centuries of movement through their tall, golden blades. On rivers, the stories changed again. Canoes sliced through glassy surfaces, their movements soundless, except for the soft clap of water against wood. These waters carried the echoes of ancient journeys, expeditions for trade, crossings made in times of hardship, or travels toward new hunting grounds. As paddlers dipped their blades into the current, the river became a storyteller of its own, murmuring reminders of where its bends led, what storms it had endured, and what wisdom it once offered to the ancestors. The people understood that following a river was not simply travel. It was reconnecting with a memory etched into the earth long before their own time. Stories were also shared through the quiet repetition of work. As women wove baskets, patterns emerged that echoed stories of creation or tales that linked animals to the gifts they offered. The steady movements of hands spinning sinew into thread or shaping clay into vessels became a physical language of memory, each motion reflecting lessons passed through generations. Even small details, spirals, lines, or painted designs held meaning, tying art to history in ways that could be read by anyone who understood the symbols. When men crafted tools for hunting or for ceremony, their shaping of stone and wood echoed stories of cunning, perseverance, and survival. Each strike of a stone against flint, or each pull of a carving knife, held the rhythm of ancient lessons. Through these grounded, patient motions, stories passed silently from one generation to the next, their words preserved through the physical memory of the hands. There were also stories carried on breath alone, quiet ones spoken to soothe a fearful child, encourage a weary traveller, or honour the passing of a loved one. These stories were rarely told around the fire. They belonged to moments when the world seemed close enough to touch, when emotions rose quietly to the surface, and when memory found its way into the space between heartbeats. In times of hardship, long winters, lean hunts, sickness, the stories offered strength. They reminded the tribe that their ancestors had survived storms harsher than the present one, that endurance lived within their blood, and that the world moved in cycles of difficulty and renewal. During these moments, stories were not spoken loudly. They were breathed into the stillness, merging with the quiet hum of resilience that kept the people moving forward. Even silence held its own stories. The gesture of pointing toward a distant mountain peak spoke of an ancient origin. The act of placing a hand on the earth carried the memory of gratitude. The careful passing of an object, an arrowhead, a feather, a bead, whispered of generations who had once held it. In this way, the story stretched beyond words, existing in the spaces between actions, in the air itself, in the earth beneath every step. Through all these movements, walking, working, hunting, gathering, the stories lived and travelled with the people. They were never confined. They expanded like breath, moved like wind, and settled like morning mist upon every aspect of life. Memory was not something stored away. It was something carried in motion, flowing through every movement the tribe made. This was how the stories endured, alive in the footsteps of the people, in the rivers they followed, in the tasks they repeated, and in the quiet moments when the world leaned in close enough to listen. Long before symbols were carved or painted, long before anything permanent was laid upon stone or hide, Native American tribes preserved stories in ways far quieter and more fluid than written language. Their memory system extended beyond words. It lived in symbols, dreams, rituals, and the silent understandings carried through the senses. These methods wove a deeper layer of storytelling, one that rested beneath the spoken tale like roots beneath a tree, unseen yet essential. Across the continent, symbols were everywhere, yet never treated as mere decorations. They appeared in painted hides, woven patterns, carved tools, beadwork, and marks left on stone faces exposed to sun and rain. Each shape carried meaning, and each meaning grew from centuries of collective memory. Spirals suggested the cycles of life and seasons, reminding the tribe that existence moved not in a straight line, but in endless loops of renewal. Zigzag lines hinted at lightning, storms, or sudden shifts in the world, stories of power that came swiftly and left deep impressions. Circles represented unity, the passage of time, the sun, the moon, the world itself. Even simple lines, dots, or curves held layers of significance understood through generations of quiet explanation. These symbols were not meant to replace spoken stories, but to surround them, reinforce them, and awaken their memory whenever seen. A hunter who carried a bow etched with small patterns remembered not just the craft of the tool, but the story behind its meaning. Stories of ancestors who first hunted in distant lands, stories of animals who offered themselves for survival, stories of respect and restraint. A child who wore beadwork patterned after an ancient tale carried that piece of memory as protection and guidance. It was as if the stories lived not only in the mind, but also on the surface of daily life, woven directly into the belongings people touched, carried, and cherished. Just as symbols guided the waking world, dreams guided the unseen world. For many Native American tribes, dreams were considered pathways through which stories traveled between the human realm and the spiritual realm. Dreams were not dismissed as illusions. They were respected as messages, insights, or reminders. They offered stories that could not be spoken in daylight, stories carried by ancestors, animals, or mysterious beings who existed beyond the physical world. When a person dreamt of an eagle, a wolf, or a storm, the tribe did not search for coincidence. They searched for meaning, considering how the dream connected to the stories known to the tribe and how it might guide the dreamer through life. Children learned early to listen to their dreams. They often woke quietly at dawn, recalling fragments, shadows moving through trees, rivers flowing against their normal direction, animals speaking with gestures instead of words. These images were steeped in symbolism, shaped by ancient memory. The elders, upon hearing them, did not impose strict interpretations. Instead, they helped the child discover how the dream connected to the world, to the tribe's history, or to the child's own path. In this way, dreams became another dimension of storytelling, a private yet essential channel of knowledge. Rituals, too, carried stories without needing spoken explanation. During seasonal ceremonies, the rhythm of drums remembered the heartbeat of the earth, echoing the same beats used by ancestors long before. Dancers reenacted creation stories, migrations, hunts, and cosmic events. Movements of arms, turns of the body, and the stamping of feet were all deliberate, each gesture a chapter recalling something ancient. Watching these dances, the people absorbed stories not from words, but from motion and rhythm. Even the youngest children understood that something sacred was being communicated, even if they could not yet articulate its meaning. In gatherings centered around rites of passage, birth, coming of age, marriage, loss, the tribe did not simply speak stories, they performed them. A young person stepping into adulthood might be guided through a ceremony filled with symbolic gestures, offerings, or endurance tests that echoed ancient lessons. The rituals reminded the youth of their place within the circle of life and the responsibility they now carried to uphold the tribe's memory. These rituals were themselves stories, stories enacted rather than told, stories that lived in the body as much as in the mind. Even the sounds of the natural world played a role in this quiet language of memory. The howl of a wolf at night reminded the people of stories about loyalty, family, and survival. The sudden flight of birds recalled tales of warning or change. Rain drumming on the roof of a lodge evoked stories of creation where water shaped the earth. Thunder rolling across the sky echoed ancient tales of powerful beings whose voices shaped the balance between land and sky. Every sound had a memory attached, a meaning that had been shaped and understood by countless generations. Through symbols, dreams, rituals, and the subtle lessons of nature, the stories extended far beyond the storyteller's voice. They seeped into every part of life, becoming an invisible network of memory that held the tribe together even when no one was speaking. They shaped how the people saw the world, how they interpreted signs, how they understood their place within a vast and interconnected existence. In this way, storytelling became more than a tradition. It became a worldview. Memory was everywhere, carried by everyone, sustained not only through narration but through living, noticing, interpreting, and honoring the countless ways in which the past whispered into the present. Across generations, every tribe had individuals who lived with a heavier, quieter responsibility than most. Those who were known as the keepers of stories, the living archives of the people. They were not chosen by force or ceremony, but recognized slowly through childhood habits and the gentle guiding eyes of elders who saw something in them. An unusual stillness, an attentive spirit, a mind that absorbed detail the way dry earth absorbs rain. These children were watched with subtle curiosity, though no one ever announced their future paths. Instead, they were allowed to grow naturally into the role, like saplings finding their place among ancient trees. As the seasons turned and years slipped by, these chosen individuals came to understand the rhythm of the tribe more deeply than others. They were often the first to rise at dawn, moving quietly through camp as the mist still clung to the earth. They observed how hunters prepared for the day, how gatherers read the land for signs of fruiting plants, how the oldest members of the tribe greeted the morning with long, slow breaths. They absorbed every motion, every ritual, every change of season, not because they were told to, but because something within them recognized the importance of knowing. In time, they would carry not only the tribe's stories, but also its practices, its wisdom, and its connection to the land. Their training was subtle, but relentless. Elders, especially those in their final years, often spent long afternoons with them, not speaking much, simply letting presence shape understanding. The elders would show them how to watch the sky and sense weather shifts that would become part of a later story. They taught them how to track the migration patterns of animals, not for hunting, but because such patterns held meaning in the tribe's oldest tales. They explained the significance of certain mountains, rivers, stones, and forests, why one hill was sacred, why a bend in the river marked the boundary of an ancestral event. These places were not random landmarks, but living chapters of a story that continued to grow. By the time these individuals reached adulthood, the tribe regarded them with a quiet respect. They were not warriors in the typical sense, nor leaders who commanded by authority. Instead, They were the guardians of memory itself. When the fires burned bright at night, these storytellers did not merely retell a tale, they summoned it. They wove landscapes from words, shaped entire worlds in the minds of listeners, and connected the tribe to ancestors whose names had not been spoken aloud for many generations. Their presence at gatherings grounded the people, reminding them that their heritage was alive and breathing. These memory keepers understood that their task was lifelong. They walked through the decades like bridges between the past and the present. They knew that every child who sat before them with wide eyes was a potential future storyteller, and they paid close attention to the ones who lingered after tales ended, staring into the dying flames as though searching for something hidden there. These children, too, were watched with gentle curiosity, for the cycle of knowledge never stopped. It only shifted hands, generation after generation. What made these memory keepers so essential was not simply their knowledge, but their ability to preserve the spirit of the tribe. Stories held more than events. They held values, warnings, celebrations, and a deep sense of belonging. And so, these keepers guarded the thread that tied the people together across centuries, ensuring that even as landscapes changed, as challenges came and passed, the identity of the tribe remained whole. Their work took place not only at night, but in the quiet edges of day, as they carried the weight of ancestral voices within them. They walked through life with a stillness that was both humbling and powerful, knowing that the hearts of their people beat in rhythm with the stories they protected. And when they spoke beneath the dark sky, lit only by fire and starlight, the entire tribe leaned forward, not just to hear a story, but to receive an inheritance. When they arrived at rivers, these storytellers paused longer than usual. Rivers were the lifelines of the land, flowing endlessly through time and shaping both the earth and the stories told upon it. The sound of running water reminded them of ancestral voices, persistent, unbroken, and always moving forward while carrying the past. Many stories were born beside these waters. Stories of creation, migration, trials, and relationships between people and the animals that relied on the same streams. A memory keeper would often sit by the riverside for hours, tracing patterns in the stones and watching the current move as though reading lines of a story written in the language of water. And then there were the mountains. These towering giants held some of the oldest stories of all, stories so ancient that even the elders spoke of them with reverence. When memory keepers climbed mountain slopes, they felt as though they were ascending into a place where the boundary between earth and sky had blurred. High above the plains, the wind carried a sharpness that seemed to clear the mind, making it easier to remember the teachings woven into the tribe's oldest tales. Mountains were often seen as places of guidance, transformation, and vision. The storytellers respected them deeply, knowing that each peak was a silent witness to centuries of tribal journeys. Through all of these landscapes, the memory keepers did more than learn stories. They lived them. They walked the same ground their ancestors had traveled, crossing rivers where old migrations had begun, resting in clearings where ancient councils once gathered, and climbing slopes where long-forgotten ceremonies had taken place under constellations that still glowed with the same cold light. Their understanding grew not through repetition alone, but through immersion. Every story had a physical anchor in the land, and the land reinforced the story. This made the oral tradition unbreakable. Even if a storyteller faltered or a generation faced hardship, the land itself remained as a guide. The memory could always be found there again, embedded in stone and soil, wind and water. As seasons passed and the years continued their slow march forward, these storytellers wove their lived experiences into what they shared at the fires. When they returned to the tribe after long travels, they carried with them not only knowledge, but the feeling of the land, the warmth of sun on open plains, the cool hush of forest shadows, the bite of mountain air, the endless murmur of rivers. These sensations gave their stories a depth that listeners could almost feel as they closed their eyes. Through them, the tribe remembered not just events, but the ancient bond between people and place. Every child who listened learned that they did not walk alone. They walked with the land, with the ancestors, with the stories that shaped them. Long before maps and written alphabets arrived, the land itself served as the great library of the Native American nations. Every ridge, valley, river bend, and clearing held meaning, not just practical knowledge of survival, but deep memory shaped by countless generations. For ancient tribes, stories did not live only in the mind, they lived in the earth. And so, the memory keepers learned to walk as though each step touched a page in a vast living book. Their journeys were rarely hurried. They moved in long arcs that followed the seasons, tracing routes that their ancestors had shaped so many lifetimes ago that no one could remember a time without them. These were paths worn smooth, not by footsteps alone, but by tradition. Each track across a meadow, each route through a mountain pass, each trail carved through a forest had a story attached to it, waiting patiently to be recalled as the memory keeper traveled through it. When these storytellers wandered through open prairie, they felt the wind pulling at their clothing like an old companion, carrying the whispers of stories that had been spoken there long before their birth. In the grasslands, where buffalo once thundered in numbers that darkened the horizon, the land held stories of migration, abundance, hardship, and renewal. When they passed through these plains, they carried the weight of every ancestor who had weathered winters, hunted for survival, or danced in celebration of the earth's generosity. They knew that each blade of grass was part of a larger story of endurance. In the forests, the canopy above them filtered sunlight into soft, shifting patterns that danced across the ground. These forests were sanctuaries where ancient tales of animal spirits, origin beings, and the teachings of the natural world still lingered. The memory keepers recognized certain trees not simply as landmarks, but as old friends. A twisted cedar might stand at the edge of a story about a long ago journey. A towering pine might mark the place where an ancestor received a vision that guided the tribe through a difficult season. The forest was never silent to a storyteller. Every rustle, every bird song, every breath of wind carried pieces of a memory waiting to be shared. When they arrived at rivers, these storytellers paused longer than usual. Rivers were the lifelines of the land, flowing endlessly through time and shaping both the earth and the stories told upon it. The sound of running water reminded them of ancestral voices, persistent, unbroken, and always moving forward while carrying the past. Many stories were born beside these waters, stories of creation, migration, trials, and relationships between people and the animals that relied on the same streams. A memory keeper would often sit by the riverside for hours, tracing patterns in the stones and watching the current move, as though reading lines of a story written in the language of water. And then there were the mountains. These towering giants held some of the oldest stories of all, stories so ancient that even the elders spoke of them with reverence. When memory keepers climbed mountain slopes, they felt as though they were ascending into a place where the boundary between earth and sky had blurred. High above the plains, the wind carried a sharpness that seemed to clear the mind, making it easier to remember the teachings woven into the tribe's oldest tales. Mountains were often seen as places of guidance, transformation, and vision. The storytellers respected them deeply, knowing that each peak was a silent witness to centuries of tribal journeys. Through all of these landscapes, the memory keepers did more than learn stories. They lived them. They walked the same ground their ancestors had traveled, crossing rivers where old migrations had begun, resting in clearings where ancient councils once gathered, and climbing slopes where long-forgotten ceremonies had taken place under constellations that still glowed with the same cold light. Their understanding grew not through repetition alone, but through immersion. Every story had a physical anchor in the land, and the land reinforced the story. This made the oral tradition unbreakable. Even if a storyteller faltered or a generation faced hardship, the land itself remained as a guide. The memory could always be found there again, embedded in stone and soil, wind and water. As seasons passed and the years continued their slow march forward, these storytellers wove their lived experiences into what they shared at the fires. When they returned to the tribe after long travels, they carried with them not only knowledge, but the feeling of the land, the warmth of sun on open plains, the cool hush of forest shadows, the bite of mountain air, the endless murmur of rivers. These sensations gave their stories a depth that listeners could almost feel as they closed their eyes. Through them, the tribe remembered not just events, but the ancient bond between people and place. Every child who listened learned that they did not walk alone. They walked with the land, with the ancestors, with the stories that shaped them. Long before maps and written alphabets arrived, the land itself served as the great library of the Native American nations. Every ridge, valley, river bend, and clearing held meaning. Not just practical knowledge of survival, but deep memory shaped by countless generations. For ancient tribes, stories did not live only in the mind, they lived in the earth. And so, the memory keepers learned to walk as though each step touched a page in a vast living book. Their journeys were rarely hurried. They moved in long arcs that followed the seasons, tracing routes that their ancestors had shaped so many lifetimes ago that no one could remember a time without them. These were paths worn smooth, not by footsteps alone, but by tradition. Each track across a meadow, each route through a mountain pass, each trail carved through a forest had a story attached to it, waiting patiently to be recalled as the memory keeper traveled through it. When these storytellers wandered through open prairie, they felt the wind pulling at their clothing like an old companion, carrying the whispers of stories that had been spoken there long before their birth. In the grasslands where buffalo once thundered in numbers that darkened the horizon, the land held stories of migration, abundance, hardship, and renewal. When they passed through these plains, they carried the weight of every ancestor who had weathered winters, hunted for survival, or danced in celebration of the earth's generosity. They knew that each blade of grass was part of a larger story of endurance. In the forests, the canopy above them filtered sunlight into soft, shifting patterns that danced across the ground. These forests were sanctuaries where ancient tales of animal spirits, origin beings, and the teachings of the natural world still lingered. The memory keepers recognized certain trees not simply as landmarks, but as old friends. A twisted cedar might stand at the edge of a story about a long-ago journey. A towering pine might mark the place where an ancestor received a vision that guided the tribe through a difficult season. The forest was never silent to a storyteller. Every rustle, every bird song, every breath of wind carried pieces of a memory waiting to be shared. Stories were not only spoken, they were sung, chanted, and drummed into life, carried by music that resonated with both the body and the spirit. In ancient Native American tribes, the boundary between story and song was often invisible. The rhythms, melodies, and sounds themselves became memory aids, encoding events, lessons, and histories in a form that was impossible to forget. The heartbeat of the drum, the rise and fall of the voice, the repetition of certain syllables or patterns, all acted as threads in the vast tapestry of oral tradition. Around the fire, the storyteller's voice would sometimes shift, rising into a chant or sliding into a melody. These variations marked important moments, a warning, a triumph, a sacred encounter with spirits or animals. The children, trained by years of listening, instinctively recognized the cues. Even without understanding every word, they felt the gravity, the excitement, or the sorrow encoded in the sounds. Over time, their own voices joined in, sometimes softly echoing, sometimes joining in ritualized response, until the entire circle participated in the living memory of the tribe. Drums, rattles, and other instruments were often present during these performances. Their sounds were more than accompaniment. They reinforced the rhythm of the story. A slow drum beat could mirror the tread of an ancestor walking a long journey. A quick staccato rhythm could mimic the flight of a hawk, the leap of a deer, or the sudden danger of a predator. The repetition of these musical cues trained memory across generations. A child who felt the pulse of the drum would later recall the story itself, the lesson embedded in each rhythm, and the ancestral knowledge behind it. Songs were sometimes associated with particular seasons, migrations, or ceremonial occasions. Certain melodies told of planting, hunting, or preparation for winter, while others recalled legendary battles, spiritual journeys, or sacred visions. Even a seemingly simple song carried layers of meaning, historical, moral, and spiritual. To forget a song was to risk forgetting part of the tribe's identity, for the melodies themselves were coded with centuries of experience. Chants often incorporated language in ways that transcended ordinary speech. Repetition, rhyme, and phrasing were used to enhance memorization and emotional impact. Some chants were deliberately long, designed to unfold over hours, during which listeners could lose themselves in the cadence and feel the story physically as well as mentally. In this way, storytelling became an immersive experience, a bridge between memory and imagination, past and present. Music also served as a unifying force. While stories alone could preserve knowledge, songs ensured that the tribe's identity was communal, shared in harmony, and carried in the very act of participation. Even those who could not attend the fire would learn fragments of history through song, remembering through melody when words alone might fade. In this way, memory was reinforced not only by repetition, but by the human body itself, the rhythm of breath, the movement of hands, the vibration of voice and drum. As generations passed, these songs and chants became repositories of wisdom, each carrying echoes of ancestors who had long since returned to the earth. They reminded the tribe that their history was living, that the lessons of the past were intertwined with every heartbeat, and that the land, the people, and the spirits were inseparable in the continuing story of life. Through spoken stories, songs, chants, rituals, symbols, dreams, and motion, the Native American tribes wove memory into every thread of existence. Every heartbeat, every step, every breath could become a reminder of who they were, where they came from, and the responsibility they carried to pass these stories forward. In ancient Native American tribes, storytelling was not limited to nights by the fire, to chants, or to symbolic markings. It lived in every gesture, every action, and every interaction that shaped daily life. The elders and memory keepers understood that lessons could be taught not only through words, but through example, and that the most profound stories often unfolded in quiet, ordinary moments. Children learned to watch, listen, and absorb, realizing that the rhythms of life itself were a repository of memory. When a hunter prepared for the day, he did more than ready his bow or track prey. He demonstrated principles embedded in centuries of survival. Each motion held meaning, patience in tracking, respect in observing wildlife, balance in taking only what was needed. A child following closely behind absorbed these lessons, silently recording them as carefully as any tale spoken aloud. Every movement became a story in itself, encoding wisdom that would later be recalled in action and memory. Gatherers showed similar care in their work. As women harvested plants, they taught the significance of timing, respect, and sustainability. When bending to pick berries or roots, they demonstrated how to harvest without harming the earth, leaving enough for the next season and honoring the spirits that guided growth. Through these daily acts, children learned stories about respect, responsibility, and the interconnectedness of life. Even in the mundane, the lessons of the past were present and alive. Life in the tribe was structured around cycles, each reinforcing the stories and the knowledge of the ancestors. Seasonal changes dictated the rhythm of travel, work, and ceremony. In spring, lessons were about renewal, planting seeds, observing animal migrations, and understanding the growth of life. Summer brought abundance, teaching skills in gathering, hunting, and communal cooperation. Autumn reminded the tribe of preparation, conservation, and gratitude for the harvest. Winter demanded endurance, resilience, and reflection. Every season carried stories, and the lessons embedded in daily tasks ensured that children experienced these narratives firsthand rather than merely hearing about them. Ceremonial life reinforced this approach. Rituals were not performances separate from daily existence. They were extensions of the tribe's living story. Preparing for a ceremony taught responsibility, patience, and reverence. Participation connected individuals to history, to the land, and to the ancestors. In these practices, children observed elders' careful handling of sacred objects, the precision of movement, and the ritualized rhythms of sound and dance. Through observation and imitation, they learned stories that could not be written down, lessons about respect, courage, and the sacred bonds holding the tribe together. Storytelling through everyday life required constant attention. Children were encouraged to notice subtleties, the change in an animal's behavior signaling the approach of a storm, the color of a leaf indicating ripeness, the behavior of rivers predicting flooding. Elders would point these signs out indirectly, asking questions or demonstrating rather than instructing directly. This indirect approach taught observation, interpretation, and connection, skills critical to survival and central to the oral transmission of knowledge. Even conflict and resolution were opportunities for teaching. Disputes over resources, misunderstandings, or mistakes became stories themselves, offering lessons on patience, fairness, negotiation, and forgiveness. By witnessing resolution, children absorbed stories of moral behavior, communal responsibility, and the consequences of action. Every interaction between people with the environment and even with unseen spiritual forces was layered with narrative meaning, reinforcing the tribe's collective memory. Through these subtle and continuous forms of teaching, the stories of the ancestors became inseparable from the lived experiences of the tribe. Knowledge was preserved not only in what was said, but in what was done, in the careful modeling of behavior, in the rhythms of labor and life. The memory of the past and the guidance for the future moved seamlessly into the present, carried in every action and every choice. The Native American worldview therefore treated life itself as a classroom and every human act as a lesson. To participate fully in the world was to absorb its stories, to live its history, and to carry it forward into the generations that followed. Among ancient Native American tribes, ceremonies were among the most profound tools for storytelling, memory preservation, and teaching. They were more than ritual. They were living stories enacted through rhythm, movement, song, and symbolism. Ceremonies transformed the abstract into the tangible, embedding lessons in the body, the senses, and the communal spirit. Every gesture, every drumbeat, every chant carried the weight of generations, creating a bridge between the past and the present, the human and the spiritual. Each ceremony marked a cycle, a passage, or a milestone, the changing seasons, the coming of age, the first hunt, or the honoring of ancestors. Within these sacred gatherings, stories that had been spoken for centuries were enacted. Movements mirrored historical events, dances replicated journeys, and chants invoked the spirits whose guidance had shaped the lives of the people. The memory of the tribe's history was inscribed into the body through repetition and participation. Those who joined the ceremony did not merely observe, they experienced the story, embodying lessons in real time. Preparation for a ceremony was itself an act of storytelling. Objects were carefully crafted or gathered with intention. Feathers representing birds from the sacred narratives, beads symbolizing stars or spirits, stones recalling mountains or ancient events. Each object carried a story, and handling it connected the participant to those tales. Elders guided younger members in the proper use of ceremonial objects, passing not only technique, but the history embedded in each artifact. Through touch, sight, and careful movement, The tribe absorbed stories as lessons woven into every sensory experience. Drumming and music were central. The heartbeat-like rhythm of drums connected participants to the pulse of the earth and to ancestral memory. Songs guided dancers through sequences that reflected historical events, migrations, or spiritual journeys. Repetition ensured that even the youngest or least experienced participants carried the story forward. Over time, these rhythms became anchors in the memory of the tribe, ensuring that the narrative survived even if words or specific details were forgotten. Music became a living mnemonic device, binding generations through shared performance. Ceremonies also reinforced communal values. They were moments when the tribe collectively honored the lessons of survival, respect, generosity, and courage. Through participation, individuals learn not only the story itself, but their role within it. They understood the interconnectedness of all people, animals, and the land. In this sense, storytelling through ceremony was inseparable from the moral and spiritual framework that guided every action and decision within the tribe. Dreams, visions, and spiritual guidance often intersected with ceremonies. Elders who interpreted dreams might prepare particular rituals to address lessons revealed in the spiritual realm. A ceremony could be a response to a vision, translating intangible insights into physical experience. These practices reinforce the notion that stories were not only human creations, they were reflections of a larger living universe in which ancestors, spirits, and the natural world all participated. Through ceremonial practice, memory became a communal, embodied experience. Stories were not just recounted, they were lived. Each person who joined a ceremony contributed to the preservation and continuation of knowledge, whether through dance, song, preparation, or simple observation. The collective memory of the tribe was reinforced nightly, seasonally, and across generations, embedding identity and culture into both body and spirit. Even after the ceremony ended, its stories lingered. Participants carried the rhythms, the chants, the lessons, and the images back into daily life. The knowledge embedded in the ceremony guided behavior, decision-making, and interaction with the world. In this way, storytelling transcended words, ensuring that memory persisted in actions, choices, and lived experience long after the fire had burned low. In ancient Native American tribes, stories were never isolated. Each tale, whether whispered beside a fire, sung in a chant, enacted in a ceremony, or mirrored in daily labor, was connected to countless others, forming a vast, intricate web of knowledge. These interwoven threads created a network of memory that reinforced itself, ensuring that even if one story was forgotten in detail, its lessons and connections endured. Every story had layers: historical, moral, spiritual, and practical. A tale of a great hunt might teach respect for the animals, strategies for tracking, and the importance of community cooperation. A story of a river crossing could guide future migrations, instruct children in observation and caution, and remind the tribe of spiritual forces believed to inhabit the waters. Each narrative was a multi-dimensional lesson, encoded with knowledge vital to survival and identity. Through repetition and layering, the tribe could convey immense wisdom without ever needing written records. Elders often emphasized connections between stories. A child listening to a tale of a mountain guardian might later recognize its echoes in a story about a river spirit or a hunting expedition. These links allowed the tribe to understand patterns in both the natural and spiritual world. Memory became relational. One story illuminated another. Past experiences informed current choices, and lessons from ancestors guided every generation. In this way, the oral tradition functioned as both archive and guidebook, a living system of knowledge sustained through careful attention and collective memory. Storytellers also relied on mnemonic devices. Repetition, rhythm, and symbolic imagery reinforced memory across years and landscapes. A chant might mirror the rise and fall of a river. A gesture might mimic the flight of a hawk. A painted pattern on a ceremonial object might encode a migration route. These elements ensured that stories could travel long distances across generations and tribes, retaining their essence, even as details shifted or evolved. Oral tradition was fluid, yet remarkably resilient, shaped by both human creativity and the steadfast need to preserve the past. The process of learning was gradual and immersive. Children began with small fragments, absorbing imagery, sound, and movement before understanding the deeper meanings. Over time, as their perception sharpened, they could comprehend complex lessons embedded within multiple layers of narrative. Adults, too, continued learning, revisiting stories with fresh perspective, deepened by experience. Memory was lifelong, and storytelling became a constant conversation between generations, a dialogue in which each person added insight while preserving continuity. In this interwoven system, every member of the tribe was both student and teacher, listening carefully, observing the land, participating in ritual, and embodying the lessons of stories. All were acts of storytelling in miniature. In performing the lessons of one story, a person might recall another, ensuring that knowledge remained alive and adaptable. The past, the present, and the future existed simultaneously in this living web, each reinforcing the other. Through these connected threads, ancient Native American tribes achieved a remarkable feat: the preservation of culture, knowledge, and identity without written language. Memory was encoded in land, body, ritual, song, and communal experience. Knowledge flowed continuously through the generations, shaped and reshaped by human experience, but always anchored in the stories of the ancestors. Each tale, each rhythm, each gesture carried the weight of countless lifetimes, binding the tribe together in time, space, and spirit. In the vast expanse of time before written records, the memory of Native American tribes was a living organism, stretching across generations like roots of an ancient tree. Each story, each teaching, each ritual, and each symbol formed part of this web, a network both fragile and enduring, dependent on human care yet resilient enough to survive centuries of change. The keepers of this knowledge, the storytellers and elders, carried enormous responsibility. Their role was not only to recount tales, but to maintain the delicate balance between past and present, between human experience and the spiritual forces woven into every story. The process began quietly, often unnoticed by those not attuned to it. A child might observe an elder tracking animals, noticing the way fingers traced soil or how eyes followed patterns invisible to the untrained observer. These moments, seemingly simple, were embedded lessons. The child absorbed not just technique, but patience, observation, reverence for the living world, and understanding of stories held in motion. Each action carried echoes of ancestral knowledge, encoded into gestures, steps, and decisions. Memory was never isolated. It moved through bodies, through eyes, through breath, and through the land itself. As the child matured, their understanding deepened. They began to notice connections between stories, between land and legend, between ritual and daily life. A tale of a river spirit could illuminate why elders warned against overfishing, while a story about a mountain guardian could explain the proper approach to sacred spaces. In this way, knowledge was never presented in isolation. It was woven into a web of cause and consequence, morality and natural observation. The tribe learned not just what to do, but why, understanding their place within a broader pattern that spanned generations and landscapes. Memory keepers carried this web in their minds with astonishing fidelity. They were trained in the nuances of cadence, gesture, melody, and symbol. They remembered not just the words of a story, but the exact inflections, pauses, and emphases of past storytellers. A pause before mentioning a dangerous animal, a heightened pitch when recalling a victorious hunt, the softening of voice in moments of sorrow. All of these subtleties were critical, ensuring that the meaning of the story survived unchanged. In the hands of these guardians, oral tradition became an art form, a living archive that was as precise as it was expansive. Yet storytelling was not static. The web of memory was adaptive. While stories were preserved in their essential truths, they could shift to reflect the environment, the needs of the people, or new lessons. A migration route changed slightly. A hunting strategy evolved. A ritual incorporated newly observed celestial phenomena. The oral tradition thrived precisely because it was alive, flexible enough to accommodate change while anchored firmly in ancestral wisdom. Even within this living adaptability, the sanctity of the stories was paramount. Elders ensured that critical lessons, those about respect for the land, ethical conduct, survival, and spiritual understanding, were preserved with meticulous care. A single story might hold multiple functions. It could entertain, teach, warn, inspire, and record history simultaneously. The storytellers understood that the tribe's survival depended on transmitting these stories faithfully, for losing them could mean losing not just knowledge, but identity itself. The land remained a constant partner in this process. Every hill, river, forest, and plain carried memory. The storytellers walk these landscapes as both guides and students, recognizing landmarks as chapters in the living narrative. When teaching, they often led learners along these paths, pointing to a rock, a tree, or a river bend, and recounting the story it held. In doing so, they transformed geography into text, memory into landscape, and narrative into experience. The children and apprentices who followed learned to read the world itself, understanding that every place had a story and every story demanded respect. Nightly storytelling sessions by the fire, ceremonial enactments, daily demonstrations, dream interpretations, songs, chants, symbols, and rituals, all of these were threads in the same intricate tapestry. Each method reinforced the others, embedding memory in multiple dimensions: auditory, visual, physical, emotional, and spiritual. No single story could stand alone. Each was part of a network that required attentive participation to remain whole, to listen, to watch, to act, to dream. Each of these was a form of learning, a form of preservation. In this living web, the tribe found continuity and identity. Even when individuals passed away, their memory lived on in the land, in the stories they had told, in the rituals they had performed, and in the lessons they had embodied. The ancestors were not gone. They continued to speak through the memory keepers, through the rhythms of daily life, and through the enduring cycles of nature itself. Through this complex and dynamic system, ancient Native American tribes ensured that every generation remained connected to its past, grounded in its environment, and prepared to carry forward its culture, values, and wisdom. The web of stories, memory, and ritual was unbreakable because it was alive and because it was nurtured with patience, attention, and reverence by every member of the tribe. In ancient Native American tribes, storytelling was more than a method of preserving knowledge. It was the heartbeat of the community, the pulse that kept the tribe alive in memory, spirit, and unity. It provided rhythm to life itself, guiding not only individual understanding, but collective identity. Without these stories, the threads that connected generations, families, and clans would fray. With them, the tribe maintained cohesion, purpose, and a sense of belonging that extended far beyond the individual. Every gathering, whether around the fire, at a ceremony, or in the quiet of daily life, served as a living classroom for the collective memory. The storytellers, elders, and memory keepers were central figures, yet every listener participated in sustaining the tribe's knowledge. Listening was not passive. It was active, requiring attention, interpretation, and engagement. To truly hear a story was to enter into a dialogue with the ancestors, the land, and the spirits. Each person became both audience and participant, contributing their understanding, their questions, and their presence to the continuity of tradition. Children were especially attuned to this dynamic. From the earliest age, they learned that listening carried responsibility. They watched the gestures of elders, felt the cadence of chants, and absorbed the significance of symbols long before they fully grasped their meanings. Through repetition and observation, they internalized lessons about survival, morality, and connection to the natural and spiritual worlds. As they matured, they became storytellers themselves, carrying forward the tribe's legacy, reinforcing the stories they had absorbed and enriching them with their own experiences. The stories also functioned as a moral compass. They offered guidance on ethics, community behavior, and respect for life. Tales of hunters who acted with wisdom and patience taught children about responsibility and restraint. Legends of spiritual beings who rewarded generosity or punished hubris instilled a deep sense of accountability. Through narrative, the tribe encoded lessons that could not be taught as effectively through lecture or command. Morality was felt, experienced, and remembered, not imposed. Music, chant, and dance reinforced these lessons. Drums echoed the heartbeat of the tribe, linking human action to the rhythms of the earth. Songs carried memory across miles, ensuring that even those absent from the fire could learn and participate. Movement and rhythm translated abstract lessons into physical experience, creating a multi-sensory education that anchored knowledge in both mind and body. Even conflict and challenge were woven into the community stories. Disputes, environmental hardship, and loss were not ignored. They became lessons and narratives that strengthened communal bonds. Through stories, the tribe reflected on mistakes, honored courage, and reinforced resilience. Each story acknowledged both the fragility and the endurance of life, teaching listeners to navigate difficulty with wisdom and grace. The communal aspect of storytelling created intergenerational bonds. Elders shared experience with adults. Adults guided children. Children observed, learned, and eventually taught. In this web, memory was safeguarded not by a single person, but by the collective awareness of the tribe. Each story was a living entity, nurtured and protected through repeated engagement, carefully passed from ear to ear, hand to hand, and heart to heart. Storytelling also reinforced the tribe's relationship with the natural world by linking narratives to landforms, animals, and celestial patterns. Stories ensured that knowledge of the environment was preserved alongside moral and spiritual teachings. Memory was anchored in both human experience and the living earth, creating a holistic understanding of the world that guided behavior, decision-making, and cultural identity. In this way, storytelling was inseparable from life itself. It was not a separate activity or a form of entertainment. It was the lifeblood of the tribe. Through the constant weaving of tales, memory, ritual, and action, the tribe remained united, resilient, and grounded. The stories carried the weight of the past, shaped the present, and prepared the next generation to carry forward both knowledge and identity. In ancient Native American tribes, storytelling was inseparable from daily life, woven into every movement, every breath, and every moment. The act of living itself became a sacred practice in preserving memory. Unlike societies that relied on written records, these tribes encoded knowledge in actions, in gestures, in repetition, and in constant observation. Every task, no matter how mundane it appeared, became a lesson in continuity and survival. From dawn to dusk, the people participated in the sacred art of memory. When a mother prepared food, she did more than nourish her children. She imparted lessons in patience, resourcefulness, and respect. As she ground corn, pounded seeds, or gathered berries, she demonstrated the timing, technique, and care required to maintain balance with the land. Each movement was deliberate, each choice informed by generations of observation. Children who watched closely were learning not only the practical skill, but the story behind it, the origin of the plant, its role in the ecosystem, and the spiritual lessons carried by its life cycle. In this way, the kitchen, the hearth, and the field became classrooms as sacred as any ceremonial space. Men and women who crafted tools or garments imbued their work with story and meaning. Stone axes, bows, pottery, and woven baskets were not mere objects. They were vessels of memory. Every cut, every carving, every stitch carried ancestral knowledge. A well-crafted arrow reflected not only skill, but understanding of the land, the animal, and the spirit it represented. By teaching younger members to reproduce these objects, elders ensured that the lessons embedded in the materials and their creation would endure. Each tool became a silent storyteller, holding centuries of experience in its form and function. Even tasks that seemed ordinary, fetching water, tending fires, gathering wood, were opportunities for observation and storytelling. The rhythm of carrying water from the river reminded the tribe of the life-sustaining role of that water, the paths ancestors had once followed, and the care required to protect it. The act of tending fires or preparing shelters was infused with stories of survival during harsh winters, lessons in patience, resilience, and foresight. In every chore, memory keepers taught that life itself was a story a continuous thread connecting past, present, and future. Travel, too, became a method of teaching. Journeys to hunting grounds, sacred spaces, or distant villages were lessons in geography, navigation, and ancestral memory. Elders demonstrated landmarks, celestial navigation, and seasonal signs. A bend in a river might echo an ancient journey. A hill could mark the site of a legendary encounter. The landscape itself served as a living map, holding the tribe's history in every stone, tree, and stream. By guiding children along these paths, elders ensured that the memory of place, survival, and spiritual connection traveled with the next generation. The repetition of daily routines also reinforced storytelling. Songs sung while working, chants recited during labor, and gestures repeated throughout the day anchored memory in the body. The rhythm of life, paired with narrative, ensured that knowledge was not simply intellectual but experiential. Children learned to internalize stories, morals, and lessons through the movements of their own bodies, allowing the tribe's wisdom to become second nature. Even in play, children absorbed stories. Games often mirrored hunting, tracking, or ceremonial practices, blending instruction with entertainment. The movements, strategies, and rules of play were subtly imbued with lessons about observation, cooperation, and respect. Play became preparation for life, ensuring that children learned both the practical and moral lessons embedded in the tribe's stories. By the time a child reached adulthood, every aspect of their life had been touched by storytelling. Memory was embedded in work, travel, play, and ritual. It was encoded in gestures, rhythm, and observation. It was reinforced through songs, chants, and symbols. The tribe lived its history every day, not simply recalling it in moments of ceremony, but embodying it in every action. In this way, storytelling was not a singular activity. It was the framework of existence itself. The tribe's knowledge, culture, and identity were preserved through lived experience, with every moment an opportunity to transmit lessons, values, and ancestral wisdom. Through this sacred art of memory, the past, present, and future were intertwined, ensuring that each generation carried forward not only stories, but the very essence of their culture and the rhythms of life that had sustained their people for countless centuries. In the world of ancient Native American tribes, the act of remembering extended far beyond words, actions, or tangible objects. Memory reached into the invisible realm, the world of dreams, visions, and spiritual encounters, where stories traveled between generations in ways both subtle and profound. Elders taught that the mind did not only store knowledge, it also received guidance from ancestors, spirits, and the natural world. Dreams became a bridge connecting the visible and invisible, the present and the past, the human and the divine. From an early age, children were encouraged to honor their dreams. Waking with images of animals, landscapes, or events was not dismissed as fantasy, but treated as communication. Dreams were studied, interpreted, and sometimes shared, but always with reverence. An image of a hawk soaring overhead could recall ancestral lessons about vigilance and freedom. The sudden appearance of a river might echo stories of migration, survival, or spiritual journeys. Elders guided young dreamers in understanding the significance of these visions, showing how the intangible world mirrored and reinforced the narratives they had already absorbed in daily life. Visions experienced during ceremony, fasting, or isolation were particularly significant. These encounters with the spiritual realm often revealed lessons crucial to the tribe's survival and moral framework. Memory keepers and shamans interpreted these visions, embedding their insights into stories, chants, or rituals. A single vision could inspire a new song, modify a ceremonial gesture, or add a layer to a familiar tale. In this way, the invisible threads of memory, woven through dreams and visions, ensured that the oral tradition remained dynamic, alive, and continually enriched. The stories derived from dreams were as carefully preserved as any spoken narrative. Elders encouraged detailed recollection, the exact order of images, the emotions felt, the symbolic elements, and the context. These dream stories were later retold, sometimes integrated with seasonal rituals, ceremonial dances, or practical lessons. A vision could influence hunting strategies, planting practices, or migration routes, linking spiritual insight directly to survival and communal knowledge. Dreams also served a moral and ethical function. They reminded individuals of their responsibilities to the tribe, to the land, and to one another. A dream might warn of hubris, encourage generosity, or inspire courage. Through such experiences, the tribe maintained a continuous dialogue with the spiritual realm, ensuring that lessons carried beyond the immediate physical world. In this manner, memory was not static. It was a living network, influenced by human experience, nature, and unseen forces alike. Even the act of remembering a dream was ritualized. A child might quietly draw symbols in the dirt, hum a melody that accompanied the vision, or recount it to an elder who would affirm and elaborate upon its meaning. Dreams were rarely isolated. They were woven into the broader tapestry of story, land, ritual, and daily life. Through attentive listening and careful transmission, these ethereal experiences became integral to the tribe's memory system, ensuring continuity across generations. The invisible threads of memory reinforced the visible ones. Stories told by the fire, songs, rituals, and daily actions were deepened and enriched by the lessons received in dreams. Memory, in this holistic system, was multidimensional. It existed in body, in land, in spirit, and in the intimate connection between them. The wisdom carried in these threads allowed the tribe to remain adaptive, resilient, and spiritually attuned, sustaining knowledge that could survive centuries without written records. Dreams and visions, therefore, were not separate from the oral tradition. They were its lifeblood. They provided insight, guidance, and moral instruction. They strengthened memory, reinforced identity, and linked every generation to the wisdom of the ancestors. In the quiet of sleep and meditation, the tribe continued to learn, remember, and pass forward the stories that defined not only their past, but the essence of who they were. Dreams also served a moral and ethical function. They reminded individuals of their responsibilities to the tribe, to the land, and to one another. A dream might warn of hubris, encourage generosity, or inspire courage. Through such experiences, the tribe maintained a continuous dialogue with the spiritual realm, ensuring that lessons carried beyond the immediate physical world. In this manner, memory was not static. It was a living network, influenced by human experience, nature, and unseen forces alike. Even the act of remembering a dream was ritualized. A child might quietly draw symbols in the dirt, hum a melody that accompanied the vision, or recount it to an elder who would affirm and elaborate upon its meaning. Dreams were rarely isolated. They were woven into the broader tapestry of story, land, ritual, and daily life. Through attentive listening and careful transmission, these ethereal experiences became integral to the tribe's memory system, ensuring continuity across generations. The invisible threads of memory reinforce the visible ones. Stories told by the fire, songs, rituals, and daily actions were deepened and enriched by the lessons received in dreams. Memory in this holistic system was multidimensional. It existed in body, in land, in spirit, and in the intimate connection between them. The wisdom carried in these threads allowed the tribe to remain adaptive, resilient, and spiritually attuned, sustaining knowledge that could survive centuries without written records. Dreams and visions, therefore, were not separate from the oral tradition. They were its lifeblood. They provided insight, guidance, and moral instruction. They strengthened memory, reinforced identity, and linked every generation to the wisdom of the ancestors. In the quiet of sleep and meditation, the tribe continued to learn, remember, and pass forward the stories that defined not only their past, but the essence of who they were. Symbols also functioned as anchors for oral stories. While a tale might be long, complex, and intricate, a single image or repeated visual motif could evoke the entire narrative. A child who had seen a carved pattern, a painted rock, or a woven motif could recall not just the story itself, but the lessons, the landscapes, and the spiritual essence it represented. Visual storytelling, therefore, was not secondary to oral tradition. It was interwoven, creating a multi-sensory experience that strengthened the transmission of knowledge. Even simple gestures carried symbolic weight. A raised hand, a circular motion, a bow, or a step in a dance could communicate ideas, mark transitions in a story, or indicate spiritual significance. These gestures were learned as part of ritual and storytelling, reinforcing memory through embodied practice. By linking movement with narrative, the tribe ensured that knowledge could be remembered physically as well as mentally, deepening understanding and engagement. Through symbols and visual representation, the tribe created a resilient system of memory. Stories were no longer dependent solely on spoken language, which could be misremembered or altered. They were anchored in enduring visual and tactile forms. In combination with oral storytelling, song, ritual, daily action, and dreams, symbols provided a holistic network of memory that preserved not only facts and events, but also moral, spiritual, and ecological knowledge. The power of visual storytelling lay in its ability to connect generations across time and space. A child who observed a symbol or participated in creating one was linked to countless ancestors who had contributed to that knowledge. The story lived in multiple dimensions, in the mind, the body, the environment, and the symbolic objects that persisted through time. These visual forms were both a map and a compass, guiding the tribe in memory, morality, and identity. Through symbols, the invisible became visible, the abstract tangible, and the ephemeral enduring. Every shape, line, and pattern carried with it the weight of generations, ensuring that the lessons, histories, and spiritual truths of the tribe would persist long after the voices of the storytellers had fallen silent. In ancient Native American tribes, the process of passing down stories was a carefully orchestrated and deeply communal practice. Knowledge did not reside in a single person or remain isolated within a few elders. It flowed through the entire tribe, forming a circle of learning that encompassed all ages. This intergenerational transmission ensured that every individual, from the youngest child to the eldest storyteller, participated in both receiving and preserving the tribe's collective memory. Children began their education at the earliest age, immersed in the rhythms, sounds, and movements of tribal life. They watched elders and adults as they hunted, gathered, crafted, and performed rituals, absorbing lessons through observation and participation. Questions were encouraged, but only at appropriate moments, teaching children patience, attentiveness, and the value of listening deeply. Even the act of remaining quiet and attentive became a form of learning, a rehearsal in mindfulness that would later allow them to recall and retell stories with precision and understanding. As children matured, they were gradually introduced to more complex narratives, symbolic systems, and ceremonial practices. Initial stories were simple, often about animals or natural phenomena, with clear lessons about behavior, survival, and ethics. Over time, these stories grew layered, incorporating history, spiritual insight, and moral guidance. Each story connected to others, forming an intricate network of knowledge that reinforced both practical and philosophical understanding. The young were encouraged to notice patterns, make connections, and see the continuity between past and present. Adults acted as guides, facilitators, and collaborators. They ensured that stories were accurate, morally instructive, and contextually meaningful. Memory keepers supervised the younger generations, correcting misinterpretations and adding depth where understanding was incomplete. Yet adults also encouraged innovation and adaptation. Stories were living entities. They could be elaborated, connected, or integrated with new experiences while preserving the essential truths of the tribe's heritage. This balance of fidelity and flexibility was crucial to the resilience of oral tradition. Elders played a dual role as teachers and mentors. They were repositories of knowledge and examples of how to live according to the tribe's principles. They guided storytelling, demonstrated proper ceremonial practice, and taught the sacred art of observation. Through their example, younger generations learned that memory was more than recollection. It was embodiment. The way elders walked, spoke, crafted, hunted, and related to the natural and spiritual world all became lessons that reinforced the stories they told. Ceremonies, communal gatherings, and everyday activities all functioned as stages for intergenerational learning. Children watched, listened, and imitated. Adults reinforced lessons through participation and guidance. Elders observed and ensured continuity. Memory was thus reinforced through repetition, observation, and embodied practice. Participation was never optional. The circle of learning depended on each member's engagement, ensuring that knowledge flowed uninterrupted across generations. The circle was both practical and spiritual. Learning the tribe's stories was essential for survival. Understanding hunting strategies, seasonal cycles, environmental cues, and social norms could determine life or death. But it was also spiritual, linking each individual to the ancestors, the land, and the cosmic order. Through the circle of learning, memory became a living force, grounding identity, culture, and communal cohesion in both experience and reverence. This intergenerational system of storytelling and learning created continuity. Even as individual storytellers passed away, their knowledge lived on in the bodies, voices, and actions of those who had learned from them. Every child who absorbed the stories became a new node in the web of memory, responsible for carrying forward the wisdom of the past while adapting it to the present. In this way, the cycle of learning was unbroken, ensuring that the heart, mind, and spirit of the tribe would endure for countless generations. In ancient Native American tribes, storytelling was the foundation upon which identity and community were built. Every tale, every ritual, and every gesture reinforced a sense of belonging, teaching individuals not only who they were, but also how they related to the land, the spirits, and each other. Memory was never abstract. It was deeply tied to the collective identity of the tribe, woven into the fabric of everyday life, and expressed in every action, song, and ceremony. Stories gave meaning to human experience. A tale about a successful hunt did more than record an event. It illustrated virtues like patience, courage, and cooperation. A story about a river spirit reminded the tribe to honor the natural world and respect its cycles. Through narrative, the tribe encoded its values, beliefs, and worldview, creating a shared framework that guided behavior and decision-making. Each member, by participating in storytelling, became both a keeper of knowledge and a living embodiment of tribal values. The social structure of the tribe was reinforced through stories. Elders, as memory keepers, held authority not through force, but through knowledge and the ability to interpret, preserve, and transmit stories. Adults modeled behavior and taught skills, while children absorbed lessons through observation, play, and guided practice. Storytelling created a dynamic system of mentorship where each generation nurtured the next, ensuring that skills, ethics, and wisdom were continuously reinforced. In this way, memory and social cohesion were inseparable. Ceremonial storytelling was particularly powerful in strengthening communal bonds. Rituals enacted shared histories, celebrated seasonal cycles, and honored both ancestors and spirits. Every song, dance, and symbolic action was an opportunity for the community to participate in the tribe's collective memory. Individuals were reminded of their interconnectedness. Their lives were not isolated, but part of a larger, enduring narrative. These ceremonies reinforced social norms, spiritual understanding, and ethical lessons, creating cohesion and continuity that extended beyond the immediate generation. The stories also defined personal identity within the tribal context. They taught individuals about their roles, responsibilities, and place within the larger web of life. Through tales of ancestors, legendary figures, and mythical beings, the tribe communicated ideals of bravery, wisdom, compassion, and humility. Each story offered examples to emulate and mistakes to avoid, creating a moral compass that guided behavior. Individuals internalized these narratives, shaping character and understanding, ensuring that personal identity was aligned with the collective ethos of the tribe. Memory was reinforced in multiple dimensions: spoken word, song, movement, ritual, visual symbols, dreams, and observation of the natural world. This multi-layered approach ensured that even if one element was forgotten, others would preserve the story's essence. For instance, a child might forget the exact words of a tale, but recall the rhythm of a chant, the gestures of a dance, or the symbolism in a painted rock, allowing the story and its lessons to endure. Through storytelling, the tribe created resilience. Stories encoded practical knowledge for survival, hunting, navigation, agriculture, and medicine, while simultaneously transmitting moral guidance and spiritual understanding. Memory became both a tool and a shield, equipping individuals to thrive in a complex and changing world. The community's identity, forged through narrative, ensured cohesion, adaptability, and continuity across generations. In this way, storytelling was the lifeblood of Native American tribes. It bound individuals to each other, to the land, and to the ancestors. It preserved knowledge, nurtured moral and spiritual growth, and reinforced the collective identity. Every story was a thread in a vast tapestry, linking the past to the present and the present to the future. Through this living tradition, the tribe's memory remained vibrant, dynamic, and unbroken, carried forward in every word spoken, every song sung, and every action performed.